In March of 2023, on a stage in Los Angeles built for an audience raised almost entirely on English-language cinema, two performers walked out to sing a song in Telugu, a language spoken by roughly 90 million people, mostly in a handful of states in southern India that most of the room had probably never been able to point to on a map. The song was called Natu Natu, from a film called RR, and for the next few minutes, something happened that the Academy Awards in 95 years of ceremonies had genuinely never produced before. The audience, largely unable to understand a single word being sung, could not stop moving. Standing ovations at the Oscars are common, expected, occasionally performative. This one was different. People were dancing. Lady Gaga, nominated in the same category, was seen mouthing along to a chorus she had heard for the first time only minutes earlier. By the end of the night, Natu Natu had won Best Original Song, becoming the first song from an Indian film ever to do so. And somewhere in India, in a story that would later be repeated by nearly every major outlet, hundreds of millions of people who had never expected their own popular culture to be handed a prize by Hollywood on its own stage found themselves watching, astonished, as it happened anyway. That moment is a useful place to start tonight, because it captures something that is easy to state as a fact, and much harder to actually feel the scale of. India is not an emerging market for pop culture. It is one of the largest, oldest, most prolific pop culture machines that has ever existed on this planet, and most of the English-speaking world has spent decades only catching fragments of it. A viral clip here, a Best Song Oscar there, a name recognized without any of the context behind it. Tonight, we are going to spend some time inside that world, moving slowly through a handful of doorways into it. A couple of films, a couple of television series, a couple of musicians, and a couple of YouTube creators whose stories trace the shape of an entirely new kind of stardom. If you are here to drift off, that is exactly what tonight is for. There is no test at the end of this, no need to retain any particular name or fact by morning. Let your shoulders soften from wherever they have been holding tension. If you are lying down, let your weight settle a little further into whatever is supporting you. My voice is going to stay slow and steady for the next hour or so, moving unhurried through stories and names that may be entirely unfamiliar to you tonight. And that unfamiliarity is not something to worry about or try to keep pace with. If a name slips past you, another one is coming. If your attention slips away entirely into sleep, that is the whole point of being here, not a failure of the format. If this is your first time listening to this channel, this is what we do. Long, calm, spoken stories about people, places, and cultural phenomena from around the world, narrated slowly enough to carry you towards sleep rather than hold you awake chasing details. There's no music behind my voice, no jarring shifts in tone, just an even, unhurried telling meant to be listened to in the dark, on the edge of sleep, the way a long story is told by someone who has all night to tell it. If you find this kind of listening helpful, subscribing costs nothing, and simply means future stories like this one find you more easily. There's no pressure in that either. For now, just settle in, and let's begin. Consider for a moment the scale of what we're actually stepping into tonight, the way you might consider the size of an ocean you have only ever seen from a single beach. India produces somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 feature films a year, across more than 20 languages, making it, by sheer volume, the largest film-producing country in the world, releasing several times as many films annually as the United States. Bollywood, the Hindi language industry centered in Mumbai, is only one piece of that machine. Significant, globally recognized, but sitting alongside equally massive industries in Telugu, Tamil, Malayalam, Kannada, Punjabi, and Bengali, each with their own stars, their own devoted audiences, their own decades of history, largely invisible to anyone outside their specific linguistic sphere. And then there is music and television, and now, layered on top of a century of cinema and song, an entirely new generation of digital creators who have turned smartphones and a front-facing camera into an industry of their own. An industry so large that the single most subscribed YouTube channel on the entire planet, out of every channel in every country, in any language, belongs not to a Western pop star or an American gaming personality, but to an Indian music label built almost entirely around Bollywood film songs. Let's start with the shape of the industry itself, because a little context makes everything that follows easier to place. Bombay, now Mumbai, has been producing films since before India's independence in 1947, and the word Bollywood, A blend of Bombay and Hollywood, coined sometime in the 1970s, its exact origin genuinely disputed by film historians, has become globally recognized shorthand for a style as much as an industry. Musical numbers woven into dramatic narrative, 3-hour runtimes built around an intermission, a tradition of family-spanning multi-generational stories, and a visual maximalism that Western cinema, for most of the 20th century, treated as a curiosity rather than something to be taken seriously on its own terms. That perception has shifted substantially and continues shifting in real time in ways that were genuinely unclear even a decade ago. Streaming platforms, Netflix, Amazon Prime Video, and India's own homegrown services have done for Indian cinema and television roughly what they did for Korean content a few years earlier. Taken work that used to require real effort to seek out, translated and subtitled and algorithmically served, and dropped it directly into households that had never previously had a pathway to encounter it. A teenager in Ohio or Manchester today can stumble across a Tamil action film or a Hindi crime drama through a streaming recommendation with roughly the same ease as stumbling across a K-drama, something that was simply not true even 5 years earlier. India's own domestic entertainment market has grown enormously alongside this, driven by increasingly affordable smartphones and data, an audience of well over 1 billion people who are, for the first time in the country's history, largely watching entertainment on a screen they personally own, rather than one shared with an entire neighborhood, the way an earlier generation experienced cinema and television. With that context in place, let's turn to the first doorway in, a film that did something almost no film from anywhere outside the traditional Hollywood-Europe axis had managed to do at that scale in living memory. Let's stay with RR a moment longer, because the film itself is worth understanding beyond the Oscar moment that opened tonight's story. Directed by S.S. Rajamouli, working in the Telugu language industry, sometimes called Tollywood, RR is, on its surface, a fictionalized account of two real Indian revolutionaries, Alluri Sitarama Raju and Komaram Bhim, who never actually met in real life, but who Rajamouli imagined into a shared story. A sweeping 3-hour anti-colonial epic set in the 1920s, blending elaborate action choreography, musical numbers, and a friendship between its two central characters so emotionally heightened it borders on the operatic. The film's fight scenes are staged with a scale and physical inventiveness that owes as much to silent-era spectacle and mythological Indian storytelling traditions as it does to anything in contemporary Hollywood action cinema. A tiger released into a colonial garden party, a man wrestling a truck to a stop, a climactic sequence involving hundreds of animals unleashed into a British compound, all staged with total earnestness rather than winking self-awareness. That earnestness turned out to be part of what made RR travel so far beyond its home audience. Western critics and audiences, largely encountering the scale and sincerity of spectacle for the first time, responded with something close to genuine astonishment, the kind of response usually reserved for discovering an entire tradition you didn't know existed. The film eventually grossed roughly $160 million worldwide, becoming one of the highest-grossing Indian films of all time internationally, packing out theaters as far from India as Japan and Canada, well outside the usual pattern of Indian films drawing primarily from diaspora audiences abroad. And then came the Oscar campaign, funded substantially out of Rajamouli's own resources, according to widely reported accounts, an unusual and expensive gamble for a film industry that had, until that point, rarely been taken seriously by the Academy at all. The gamble paid off in the form of that Best Original Song win, not simply a trophy, but a genuine watershed moment, the first competitive Oscar ever awarded to a song from an Indian film, opening, many industry analysts have suggested since, a door that Indian cinema may spend years continuing to walk through. Let's turn now to a very different kind of film, one operating at a completely different scale of stardom within India's own domestic industry, even if its international footprint has been smaller. If RR represents Indian cinema breaking out toward a global audience largely unfamiliar with it, our second film represents the sheer, almost incomprehensible scale of stardom that exists purely within India's own borders, built around a single actor whose name recognition across the country rivals or exceeds that of any performer working anywhere in the world. Shah Rukh Khan has been one of Bollywood's most bankable stars since the early 1990s, a career now spanning more than 3 decades, built on a screen persona, charming, romantic, a little self-deprecating, endlessly watchable. that has made him, by some measures, the most recognized actor on the planet, given the sheer size of the audience that has grown up watching him across generations. In 2023, after a several-year gap from major leading roles, Khan returned with Pathaan, an action thriller that became one of the biggest box office events in Bollywood's history, part of what industry observers began calling his triumphant comeback year, followed later that same year by another massive hit, Jawan. Pathaan alone crossed into the very small club of Indian films to gross over 1,000 crore rupees worldwide, a threshold in the hundreds of millions of dollars that only a handful of films in Indian cinema history had ever reached, joining an elite list that includes some of the biggest blockbusters the industry has ever produced. What makes a film like Pathaan worth sitting with, beyond its raw commercial numbers, is what it reveals about the particular kind of collective, almost ritualistic experience Bollywood films can still generate in a way that has become rarer in many other film industries around the world. Opening weekends for a major Shah Rukh Khan film are treated, in parts of India, less like ordinary box office events and more like genuine public celebrations. Fans lining up outside cinemas hours before dawn, whistling and cheering at the first appearance of his face on screen, regardless of what is actually happening in the scene. A kind of communal, participatory movie-watching experience that Western multiplex culture largely left behind decades ago. It is, in its own way, not unlike the stadium-scale communal experience we've spent time with on other nights on this channel, just transplanted into a darkened cinema instead of an outdoor arena, and repeated in thousands of theaters across a country of over 1 billion people, all at once, on the same opening weekend. Let's move now from cinema to television, and to a series that shows a very different register of Indian storytelling, lush, historical, and deliberately, defiantly opulent. Heeramandi. The Diamond Bazaar arrived on Netflix in 2024, directed by Sanjay Leela Bhansali, a filmmaker already well known for a directorial style built around maximalist visual spectacle. Vast, ornate sets, elaborate costuming, a camera that lingers on gold and velvet and candlelight, with the patience of someone who wants you to feel the weight of every object on screen. The series is set in the Heeramandi district of pre-independence Lahore, then part of British India, and follows a group of courtesans, women trained not simply in music and dance, but in poetry, wit, and the elaborate social performance required to navigate a world where their profession granted them genuine cultural influence, even as it denied them almost every other form of social power available to women of higher formal status. It is a setting largely unfamiliar to Western audiences, rooted in a specific and historically real tradition of courtesan culture that once held serious cultural weight in parts of South Asia, treated by the show with a blend of romantic reverence and clear-eyed acknowledgement of the exploitation and precarity underlying that world. Heeramandi became, by the measures that matter to a streaming platform, a genuine success, topping IMDb's most viewed Indian series charts in the year of its release, part of a broader wave of Netflix's growing investment in big-budget Indian original productions, aimed explicitly at both domestic and international subscribers simultaneously. Critical reception within India was somewhat more divided than the audience numbers suggested, with some critics finding the show's visual excess occasionally overwhelming the storytelling underneath it, a tension that, interestingly, echoes almost exactly the kind of critique leveled at maximalist, spectacle-driven work in other film industries, the same tension between too much and exactly enough that shows up whenever an artist commits fully to visual excess as a storytelling tool in its own right. Now let's turn to something almost entirely opposite in tone and scale, because the contrast tells you something important about the range Indian television is currently working across. Panchayat, streaming on Amazon Prime Video since 2020, follows a young engineering graduate named Abhishek who, unable to find better employment, reluctantly takes a government administrative job in a small remote village, the kind of quiet, unglamorous rural posting that, in the show's gentle telling, he initially treats as something close to a personal failure, a placeholder job to be endured until something better comes along. What follows across the show's now multiple seasons is almost defiantly small in scale compared to the sweeping historical opulence of something like Heeramandi. Mundane village disputes, generator repairs, a slow-built friendship with the village's elderly, endlessly patient secretary, a village council election treated with the same narrative weight most shows reserve for a national political thriller. And yet Panchayat has become, by wide critical and audience consensus, one of the most beloved Indian series of the last several years, repeatedly topping best-of lists and drawing an unusually devoted, almost protective fan base, the kind of show people describe not as thrilling but as comforting, a series they return to specifically because nothing dramatic ever happens in it. It offers an intimate, warm, low-stakes portrait of rural Indian life that stands in deliberate contrast to the more commonly exported image of India as either ancient and mystical or hyper-modern and chaotic, instead offering something quieter, small-town bureaucracy, slow friendships, a place where the biggest event of a season might be fixing a broken road. Side by side, Heeramandi and Panchayat make an interesting pair precisely because of how little they resemble each other. One drenched in candlelight and courtesan poetry in colonial-era Lahore, the other set in a sun-bleached, dusty village office with a broken ceiling fan. And yet both, in their own registers, are described by their most devoted viewers using almost exactly the same word, comfort. Even the historically weighted, visually maximalist Heeramandi is, underneath its opulence, built around a kind of ritual, repeatable pleasure in its own aesthetic richness, not unlike the way a viewer might return to a favorite period drama specifically for its texture rather than its plot. Let's move now to music, and to a name that, unlike almost everyone else we'll spend time with tonight, actually is widely known well beyond India's borders, even if the full shape of his career often isn't. R. Rahman had already been, for roughly 2 decades before most Western audiences ever heard his name, one of the most prolific and influential film composers in the world, scoring an almost unimaginable volume of Tamil and Hindi films from the late 1980s onward, blending orchestral scoring with Indian classical traditions, electronic production, and a melodic sensibility that made him, within India, a genuine household name. The kind of composer whose new film score was itself a cultural event, anticipated and dissected the way a major album release might be anywhere else. Then in 2008, an English director named Danny Boyle, working on a modestly budgeted film about a Mumbai slum dweller who becomes an unlikely game show contestant, brought Rahman in to score what would become Slumdog Millionaire, a film that went on to sweep the following year's Academy Awards, including 2 Oscars for Rahman himself, one for the score, and one alongside lyricist Gulzar for the song Jai Ho. That win made Rahman just the second Indian composer, and to that point the most internationally visible, to break through to that level of Western recognition. A genuine landmark moment, though one worth sitting with carefully, because it also illustrates something a little uncomfortable about how global recognition tends to work. Rahman had already, by 2008, been one of the most significant composers alive by any reasonable measure of scale and influence, having scored hundreds of films and sold, by various industry estimates, hundreds of millions of records across a career that long predated Slumdog Millionaire. It took a British director's film, built around a story about India rather than made from within Indian cinema itself, to finally hand him the kind of global recognition his existing body of work had already, quietly, more than earned. It is a pattern worth noticing, because we'll see something close to its inverse in the next musician we spend time with tonight, someone who found global recognition not through a Western intermediary translating his work for outside audiences, but by walking directly onto the biggest stage in Western pop culture and simply performing, unapologetically, in his own language. Diljit Dosanjh began his career in the early 2000s as a Punjabi-language singer, building a devoted regional following across Punjab and the Punjabi diaspora communities scattered through Canada, the UK, and beyond, long before most of the world had any exposure to Punjabi music at all. He built a parallel acting career across both Punjabi and Hindi cinema, becoming a recognizable face well beyond music alone. But it was a single set at the Coachella Valley Music and Arts Festival in April of 2023 that transformed him, almost overnight, into a genuinely global figure. Walking onto that stage in a black kurta and turban, becoming the first Punjabi-language artist ever to perform at the festival, Dosanjh reportedly told the crowd in Punjabi that Punjab had arrived at Coachella, and the crowd, largely unfamiliar with a single word of the language being sung, danced anyway. Footage of the American DJ Diplo enthusiastically dancing along in the crowd, becoming itself one of the most widely shared clips from that year's festival. What followed was a rapid string of crossover moments that, taken individually, might each seem like a novelty, but that together sketch the outline of something more substantial, a genuine opening of Western pop culture's ear to a sound it had largely ignored. A collaboration with the Australian singer Sia, a guest appearance alongside Ed Sheeran on stage in Mumbai, a Punjabi-Spanish crossover track with the Colombian singer Camilo, an appearance on Jimmy Fallon's Tonight Show, introduced by Fallon himself as, simply, the biggest Punjabi artist on the planet, teaching the host a few words of the language on live American television. And in a milestone that had not yet happened at the time of an earlier film we've spent time with on this channel, Freddie Mercury's own legendary Wembley Stadium performance, Dosanjh is set to become the first Punjabi artist ever to headline that same iconic London venue in a show scheduled for September of 2026, a symbolic passing of a particular kind of stadium-scale cross-cultural triumph from one generation and one genre to an entirely different one, on the exact same ground. What connects Rahman and Dosanjh, despite the very different paths that carried them to global recognition, is the same underlying story that has run through nearly every figure we've spent time with on this channel before. Talent built patiently, over decades in Rahman's case, over 2 decades in Dosanjh, within an industry and a language largely invisible to a global audience, until a single moment, an Oscar campaign, a festival slot, finally handed that talent the wider stage it had, in both cases, already earned many times over before the rest of the world happened to notice. Let's turn now to the newest, and in some ways, the most distinctly of this moment layer of Indian pop culture. The generation of creators who built their fame not through film studios or record labels, but through a smartphone camera, an internet connection, and, in the beginning, absolutely no institutional support of any kind. Ajay Nagar, better known by his channel name CarryMinati, started out, like a huge number of teenage YouTubers around the world in the mid-2010s, as a gaming commentator, building a modest following around gameplay videos before pivoting toward the format that would eventually make him one of the most recognized faces in Indian digital media. Roast videos, rapid-fire comedic takedowns of other creators, trends, and public figures, delivered in a rapid, slang-heavy blend of Hindi and English that became, for an entire generation of young Indian internet users, a genuinely definitive voice of the platform. His rise was not without real controversy. A widely publicized 2020 video responding to a dispute between YouTube and TikTok creators became, for a period, one of the most liked videos on YouTube worldwide, drawing both an enormous surge in subscribers and serious criticism over its tone, before YouTube eventually removed it entirely for violating platform policies. That controversy, rather than derailing his career, arguably cemented his position as one of the platform's most talked-about Indian personalities, a reminder of how thoroughly the boundaries between virality, controversy, and lasting fame have blurred in the internet-native generation of celebrity in a way that simply did not exist for the film and music stars of earlier decades. Our final figure tonight tells a gentler, and in some ways, more improbable version of that same story. Before he was anyone in particular, Bhuvan Bam was working as a night singer in a Mughlai restaurant in Delhi, earning, by his own later accounts, a salary equivalent to a few $dozen a month, chasing a dream of a music career that showed no obvious signs of ever taking off through conventional channels. In 2015, almost on a whim, he started uploading short comedic videos to a channel called Double B Key Vines, playing every character himself using nothing more than his phone's front-facing camera propped up in his bedroom. A tech-illiterate, endlessly exasperated father, a tearful, oversensitive mother, an angry, over-the-top schoolteacher, a small ensemble cast of exaggerated, deeply familiar Indian family and neighborhood archetypes, all performed by one person switching between voices and postures within the same single, unedited take. The channel grew at a pace that startled even Bam himself, by his own later accounts, becoming the first individual Indian YouTuber to cross 10 million subscribers, and eventually growing well beyond that into one of the most subscribed individual creator channels in the country. What makes Bam's story worth sitting with, beyond the raw subscriber numbers, is what came after that initial explosion of fame. Rather than simply continuing to churn out short comedic vines indefinitely, he gradually expanded into music, releasing his own original songs, and finding real commercial success there too. And then into longer-form scripted work, co-producing and starring in web series like Dindora and the Bollywood-adjacent Taza Khabar, a genuine and increasingly common pipeline in contemporary India, from bedroom-made internet comedy all the way through to mainstream film and streaming stardom. A pathway to that same tier of visibility that, for the film stars we spent time with earlier tonight, used to require years of formal industry connections and screen tests just to attempt. It is worth pausing gently on just how recent and how genuinely unprecedented that pathway actually is. A generation ago, the distance between kid with a phone in a bedroom and recognized national entertainer would have been, for all practical purposes, uncrossable in India, just as it would have been almost everywhere else in the world. Bhuvan Bam and CarryMinati, in their very different registers, one gentle and character-driven, the other sharp-edged and confrontational, both crossed that distance within roughly becoming in the process arguably more immediately recognizable to a young Indian audience today than most of the traditional Bollywood stars who came before them. A genuinely new tier of fame built entirely outside the old studio and record label machinery that shaped every other figure we've spent time with tonight. Before we move further, it's worth pausing on something that runs underneath nearly everything we've touched on so far tonight, a tradition so central to Indian popular culture that it's easy to mention in passing without ever really explaining why it works the way it does. The elaborate musical sequences that have defined Bollywood cinema since well before independence, and the strange, distinctly Indian institution that makes them possible: playback singing. In most film industries, when an actor appears to sing on screen, they are either actually singing themselves or occasionally lip-syncing to a pre-recorded vocal track, usually treated as something of a technical necessity to be smoothed over as invisibly as possible. Indian cinema took a different approach entirely and turned it into an entire parallel industry of its own. From the 1940s onward, a small number of specialized playback singers, vocalists who never appear on screen themselves, have recorded the songs that actors then lip-sync to in the finished film. And rather than treating this as a technical workaround to be hidden, Indian audiences have, for generations, celebrated the singers themselves as major stars in their own right, entirely separate from the actors whose faces appear alongside their voices. Lata Mangeshkar, who recorded an almost unfathomable number of songs across roughly 7 decades of playback singing, from the 1940s until shortly before her death in 2022, became one of the most beloved and honored cultural figures in the entire history of independent India, awarded some of the country's highest civilian honors, mourned by literally hundreds of millions of people upon her death, despite most of her audience never having seen so much as a photograph connecting a specific song to her face rather than to whichever actress happened to be lip-syncing on screen at the time. This tradition explains something that often puzzles first-time Western viewers of Bollywood cinema: why a serious dramatic film might suddenly pause its plot for a 5-minute musical sequence set in the Swiss Alps or on a moving train, seemingly disconnected from the scene immediately before or after it. These sequences are not, as they can appear to outside eyes, careless interruptions of the story. They function more like a parallel emotional register, a heightened, symbolic space where feelings too large for ordinary dialogue, the first flush of falling in love, grief, joyous celebration, get expressed through music, choreography, and often elaborate location shooting in a way the more restrained dramatic scenes around them are not expected to carry. A well-placed song, built around a genuinely great playback vocal performance, can become more culturally durable and more widely remembered than the film that originally contained it. Heard at weddings, sung at karaoke nights, covered by new artists decades later, entirely independent of whether anyone still remembers the specific plot point the song was originally written to accompany. That tradition has evolved considerably over the past 2 decades, as composers like Rahman brought increasingly sophisticated production and genre blending into film scoring, and as the rise of independent non-film playback singers and music platforms has gradually loosened the industry's older, tighter relationship between film release and song release. But the underlying instinct that music itself deserves to be treated as a headline attraction, worthy of its own stardom, separate and sometimes even more enduring than the film built around it, remains one of the most distinctive features separating Indian popular cinema from almost every other major film tradition in the world. And it helps explain something about why a figure like A.R. Rahman or a song like Nattu Nattu can carry cultural weight in India that goes well beyond what an equivalent film score or musical number typically achieves in Western cinema, where the song usually exists in service of the film rather than occasionally eclipsing it. It's worth spending a little more time with Shah Rukh Khan's own story before we move on, because it follows a shape that should, by this point in the evening, feel oddly familiar. The same outsider-to-icon pattern that has run through so many of the figures this channel has spent time with before, just relocated to Mumbai instead of London or Memphis or Zanzibar. Khan was born in Delhi in 1965, not into a film family and not into any particular wealth, the son of a father involved in India's independence movement and a mother who worked as a magistrate. Both of his parents died relatively young, his father when Khan was still a teenager, his mother a few years later, leaving him, by his own later accounts, without the kind of family safety net or industry connections that have traditionally smoothed the path for so many Bollywood stars who come from established film dynasties, several of which we've touched on only briefly tonight, but that dominate a significant portion of Hindi cinema's biggest roles even now. Khan started in television, moved to Mumbai with, by most accounts, very little beyond ambition and a genuine outsider's hunger to prove himself in an industry that had no particular reason to expect anything from him, and began building a film career in the early 1990s, initially by taking on morally ambiguous, sometimes outright villainous roles that a more image-conscious rising star might have avoided, before pivoting toward the boyishly romantic, charismatic screen persona that would eventually make him one of the most bankable actors India has ever produced. Over 3 decades, that persona earned him the informal title King Khan, or simply King, a nickname used with genuine, unironic reverence by hundreds of millions of fans across India and its diaspora, alongside Badshah, an older Hindi and Urdu word for emperor or sovereign, repurposed by fans and media alike to describe a kind of cultural dominance that has, by most measures, no direct equivalent anywhere in Western film stardom. An actor whose presence in a film alone, regardless of the film's actual quality or reception, can be relied upon to generate an opening weekend event on a scale most Hollywood stars, even the biggest ones, no longer reliably command in an era of fragmented franchise-driven box office. When Khan appeared, in early 2023, following that several-year gap from major leading roles that preceded Pathaan, reports from cinemas across India described fans literally dancing in the aisles at first sight of him on screen. An unscripted, spontaneous audience reaction that had been building, unspoken, throughout the entirety of his absence from major starring roles. What makes Khan's story worth returning to, alongside everyone else we've discussed tonight, is how thoroughly it undercuts any lazy assumption that Indian stardom simply mirrors, at a larger scale, the same celebrity machinery familiar from Hollywood. Khan built his empire not through a single defining franchise, the way many contemporary Western stars have, and not primarily through international recognition, though that has grown considerably over his career, but through an unusually intimate, sustained, decades-long relationship with a genuinely enormous domestic audience who have, in a real sense, watched him age across the screen alongside their own lives. A teenager's first Shah Rukh Khan film in the 1990s, watched again with their own children 30 years later, an unbroken thread of shared cultural experience across generations in a way that very few entertainment figures anywhere in the world have managed to sustain for quite this long. Let's also spend a little more time with S.S. Rajamouli, the director behind RR, because that Oscar moment we opened tonight's story with didn't emerge out of nowhere. It was the culmination of a filmmaking career spent, quite deliberately, pushing against the assumption that a regional language Indian film industry, working with budgets a fraction of a typical Hollywood blockbuster, couldn't compete with Western cinema on pure visual spectacle and scale. Before RR, Rajamouli had already reshaped the landscape of Indian cinema once, with the 2-part Bahubali saga, released in 2015 and 2017. A sprawling fictional fantasy epic set in an invented ancient kingdom, built around court intrigue, a hidden royal heir, and battle sequences of a scale and technical ambition that few Indian films had previously attempted. Bahubali. The conclusion, the second installment, became, at the time of its release, the highest-grossing Indian film ever made, and perhaps more significantly for the story we're telling tonight, it demonstrated something the Indian film industry had suspected but never fully proven at that scale, that a Telugu language film, dubbed and subtitled, could travel across India's own internal linguistic boundaries and draw massive audiences in Hindi-speaking states that had traditionally paid far more attention to Bollywood than to southern Indian cinema, and that it could do the same internationally, drawing meaningful audiences in places with no particular prior interest in Telugu language film at all. RR, in that sense, wasn't Rajamouli's first attempt at this kind of scale-driven crossover ambition. It was his second, bigger swing, made with a considerably larger budget, reportedly among the most expensive films ever produced in India at the time of its release, and aimed even more deliberately at an international audience from the outset. The production reportedly took years, involved extensive location shooting, and required the kind of large-scale coordinated animal work, stunt choreography, and visual effects that would tax the resources of a considerably larger Hollywood production, all assembled by a Telugu-language film industry that, again, most audiences outside India had never had particular reason to think about at all before RR's release forced the question. The film's two lead actors, Ram Charan and N.T. Ramarao Jr., known widely as Junior NTR, both came into the project as already established stars within Telugu cinema. Both descended, in fact, from prominent South Indian film and political families. Ram Charan's father, Chiranjeevi, and Junior NTR's grandfather, N.T. Ramarao Sr., both towering figures in Telugu cinema's own history, the latter having gone on to serve as Chief Minister of the state of Andhra Pradesh, a not uncommon crossover between film stardom and elected political office that has occurred repeatedly across several regional Indian film industries in ways that would strike most Western audiences as genuinely unusual. Watching the two of them share the screen in RR and later share that same Los Angeles stage together at the Oscars carried a weight within India that most international audiences, encountering the film with no prior context, would have had no way of registering. Two of southern Indian cinema's most significant film dynasties, standing together on the biggest stage in Western entertainment, representing an entire regional industry that had spent decades being systematically overlooked by the same global media apparatus now applauding them. Let's return for a moment to a fact mentioned earlier tonight and sit with it a little longer, because it is genuinely one of the strangest and most underappreciated statistics in all of global internet culture. The single most subscribed YouTube channel on the entire planet is T-Series, an Indian music label built almost entirely around Bollywood film songs and music videos, with a subscriber count numbering in the hundreds of millions, surpassing every individual creator, every American media company, every K-pop label, every channel of any kind, anywhere, in any language. T-Series was not born on the internet at all. It began in the 1980s as a cassette tape company, founded by Gulshan Kumar, who built the label into a dominant force in the Indian music industry well before YouTube or even the internet as most of us know it existed, largely by aggressively undercutting the pricing of established, more prestigious labels and flooding the market with affordable, widely available cassette tapes of Bollywood soundtracks. Kumar was murdered in 1997 in a case connected to organized crime figures operating within the Bollywood industry at the time, a genuinely dark chapter in the label's history, and leadership passed to his son, Bhushan Kumar, who steered the company through the transition from cassettes to CDs to digital downloads to, eventually, YouTube, where T-Series' existing dominance over Bollywood's musical output meant that essentially every major Hindi film song released by any major studio ended up, sooner or later, running through T-Series' massive catalog and audience reach. For a period in 2018 and 2019, T-Series became genuinely famous outside India, specifically because of a prolonged, highly publicized subscriber race against PewDiePie, at the time YouTube's most subscribed individual creator, a competition that took on an almost sporting rivalry among global YouTube audiences, complete with dedicated fan campaigns on both sides, viral memes, and endless subscriber count tracking websites, refreshed obsessively by fans invested in an outcome that, from the outside, must have looked almost absurd. A Bollywood music label and a Swedish gaming commentator locked in a subscriber battle followed by millions of people who, in many cases, had no particular connection to either channel's actual content. T-Series eventually won that race decisively and has never relinquished the top position since, standing today as a quiet, slightly overlooked monument to just how enormous the audience for Indian film music actually is, once you stop measuring it by Western media coverage and start measuring it by raw global viewership numbers. That same underlying pattern, genuine, massive scale, systematically underrepresented in English-language media coverage relative to its actual size, repeats itself across nearly every corner of Indian streaming and digital entertainment. Netflix, Amazon Prime Video, and Disney Plus Hotstar have all poured increasing investment into Indian original programming over the past several years. Not as a charitable gesture toward an underserved market, but because the numbers involved are simply too large to ignore. India's internet-connected population alone, even accounting for the large portion of the country still without reliable broadband access, comfortably exceeds the entire population of the United States and most of Europe combined. Shows and films that might register as a modest regional hit by pure population math in most other countries can, in India, represent an audience larger than the entire population of many nations discussed elsewhere on this channel. There is one more pillar of Indian popular culture worth spending some time with tonight, one that doesn't fit neatly into film, television, music, or internet video, but that arguably commands more sustained daily attention across the country than any of them individually: cricket, and specifically the Indian Premier League, the annual T20 cricket tournament that has, in less than 2 decades, become one of the most valuable sporting properties on the planet. Cricket's popularity in India predates the IPL by well over a century, a colonial-era import that India eventually came to dominate on the field as thoroughly as any nation ever has, with the Indian national team's matches against rivals like Pakistan and Australia routinely drawing television audiences in the hundreds of millions, numbers that dwarf the viewership of almost any single sporting event anywhere else in the world, Super Bowl included. What the IPL did, starting in 2008, was take that existing near-religious devotion to the sport and restructure it around a fast-paced 3-hour match format explicitly designed for television and, later, mobile streaming, combined with a franchise model borrowed loosely from American professional sports, complete with city-based teams, an annual player auction conducted with the theatrical intensity of a live broadcast event in its own right, and a deliberate infusion of Bollywood-style spectacle, cheerleaders, and celebrity ownership into what had previously been a more staid, traditionally administered sport. The league's commercial scale is genuinely difficult to overstate. Broadcast and streaming rights for the IPL have sold for sums placing it, on a per-match basis, among the most valuable sports media rights deals anywhere in the world, and the tournament's franchises are now valued, collectively, in the billions of dollars, owned by a mix of Bollywood stars, major Indian conglomerates, and international investors. Matches routinely draw hundreds of millions of concurrent streaming viewers on Indian platforms, numbers that occasionally strain the technical infrastructure of the streaming services carrying them, a genuinely unusual problem to have, and one that speaks to just how central the IPL has become to a specific, roughly 2-month stretch of the Indian cultural calendar each spring. Offices adjusting schedules around match timings, informal betting, and fantasy league culture exploding across every messaging app and social platform, an entire generation of Indian sports fans for whom the IPL, rather than international test cricket, has become their primary informative relationship with the sport. What connects the IPL to everything else we've spent time with tonight is the same underlying instinct that shapes Bollywood's musical numbers and Shah Rukh Khan's opening weekend crowds and the entire T-Series subscriber phenomenon, an evident, deeply rooted cultural preference for shared, larger-than-life communal spectacle, consumed simultaneously by an enormous audience rather than smaller, more individually curated entertainment experiences. It is, in its own way, a sporting cousin to the stadium-scale collective transcendence we've spent time with elsewhere on this channel, just wearing cricket whites and a franchise jersey instead of a rock star's stage costume. Let's spend a little more time with cricket before we move toward the close of tonight's story, and specifically with the player most responsible for turning the sport into the near-religious force it remains across India today, decades before the IPL's franchise glitz arrived to modernize its presentation. Sachin Tendulkar made his debut for the Indian national cricket team in 1989, at just 16 years old, and went on to play international cricket for roughly 24 years, retiring in 2013, holding an extraordinary collection of career batting records, several of which remain unbroken today. But the sheer statistical weight of his career, considerable as it is, only partially explains the scale of what he came to represent within India during those decades. Tendulkar rose to prominence through the 1990s and 2000s, a period of enormous economic and social transformation in India following the country's economic liberalization in 1991, and became, almost by coincidence of timing, a kind of living symbol of a newly confident, opening, rapidly modernizing nation, carrying, quite literally, the hopes of thoroughly disproportionate numbers of people onto the field with him every time he walked out to bat, a pressure that became so widely acknowledged that Indian sports commentary developed an entire specific vocabulary around the particular weight of expectation Tendulkar was understood to carry compared to any other player on the team. He earned the informal title, God of Cricket, used with a level of genuine, largely unironic devotion that few sporting figures anywhere in the world have ever received, in a country where cricket itself already occupies something closer to religious significance in the daily rhythms of hundreds of millions of lives than a mere sport typically does anywhere else. Streets across India were reported, repeatedly, over the course of his career, to empty out entirely whenever Tendulkar came out to bat in an important match. Businesses pausing operations, entire offices gathering around a single shared television, a phenomenon documented so consistently across so many major matches throughout his career that it became something closer to established cultural fact than mere anecdote. When he finally retired in 2013, playing his last ever international match in front of a sold-out home crowd in Mumbai, the emotional scale of the farewell, the crowd, the tributes, the sheer visible grief mixed with gratitude on the faces of teammates and rivals alike carried a weight that felt, to those watching, considerably closer to a national moment of mourning and celebration combined than to the retirement of an individual athlete, however accomplished. What connects Tendulkar's story to nearly everyone else we've spent time with tonight is, once again, that same familiar shape. Extraordinary, sustained talent, built patiently over decades, that came to mean something to an audience far larger than the sport or medium containing it could, on its own, fully explain. Tendulkar didn't just play cricket well. He became, across nearly a quarter-century in the public eye, a kind of steady emotional anchor for an entire country navigating enormous, often disorienting change, in roughly the same way, though through an entirely different medium, that Lata Mangeshkar's voice became inseparable from an entire nation's collective memory, or that Shah Rukh Khan's screen presence became a fixture spanning multiple generations of the same families. It is perhaps one of the more consistent threads running underneath everything we've touched on tonight, that Indian popular culture, across cinema, music, sport, and now digital video, seems to reward not just talent but longevity and consistency, rewarding figures who show up reliably across decades until they stop being simply admired and start becoming something closer to a fixed point that an entire country can measure its own passing years against. Let's return, before we close, to a name mentioned only briefly earlier tonight, because her story deserves more room than a single passing sentence gave it, and because it connects back to nearly everything else we've spent time with. The way a voice, carried through decades of film after film, can become something closer to a shared national memory than an individual career. Lata Mangeshkar was born in 1929 into a family of musicians and theater performers in what was then the princely state of Indore, and began performing professionally as a child after her father's death left the family in financial hardship and made her, as the eldest of 5 children, an unexpected breadwinner while still in her early teens. Her career as a playback singer began in the 1940s, in the final years before Indian independence, and continued, without any real interruption, for roughly 8 decades, an almost unfathomable span, recording new songs for new films across the entire arc of independent India's existence, from its earliest, uncertain years as a newly sovereign nation through economic liberalization in the 1990s, and into the streaming era, still recording occasional new material well into her 80s. The scale of her output resists easy summary. Estimates of the total number of songs she recorded across her career vary considerably depending on methodology, but even conservative counts place the figure in the tens of thousands, across dozens of languages beyond Hindi alone, a body of work so vast that Indian music historians have generally given up trying to produce a fully complete catalog of it. What made her voice so distinctive and so enduringly beloved across such an extraordinarily long career was a quality critics and fellow musicians have often struggled to fully articulate, a clarity and purity of tone that could carry both the aching vulnerability of a heartbreak song and the soaring celebratory joy of a wedding number with equal, apparently effortless conviction, recorded across 7 decades of shifting musical trends and production styles without ever losing the specific timbre that made her instantly recognizable from the very first note. Her cultural stature within India, by the time of her death in February of 2022, had grown to something that genuinely has very few direct parallels anywhere else in global entertainment. She was awarded the Bharat Ratna, India's highest civilian honor, in 2001, joining a very short list of recipients that includes some of the country's most significant political and scientific figures, not merely its artists. Her death prompted a 2-day period of official state mourning, with government buildings lowering flags and a state funeral attended by the country's prime minister, a level of formal national recognition typically reserved for heads of state, extended instead to a singer whose actual face had, for most of her audience across most of her career, never been the point of the performance at all, precisely because of the playback tradition we spent time with earlier tonight. Millions of people who could not have picked her out of a photograph could nonetheless recognize her voice within a single held note, carried inside virtually every Indian household's collective memory of weddings, of films watched with grandparents now gone, of a specific, aching high note in a specific decades-old love song that meant something entirely personal and unrepeatable to whoever happened to be listening. There is something worth sitting with gently in the fact that a voice can become that thoroughly woven into a nation's shared emotional life without the audience ever needing to know much at all about the woman behind it. A kind of fame built entirely on what the voice itself could carry, independent of image, of interviews, of the modern machinery of personal brand building that surrounds nearly every other figure we've discussed tonight. In an industry now increasingly shaped by algorithm-driven virality, festival moments captured on 1,000 phones simultaneously, and the relentless visibility demanded of contemporary stardom. Lata Mangeshkar's 8-decade career stands as a quiet reminder that there was, not so long ago, another way entirely for a voice to become inseparable from an entire country's sense of itself, one recorded song at a time, one family's living room at a time, across generations who never needed to see her face to already know, completely and immediately, exactly who was singing. One last thread worth pulling before we let this all settle, because it's the kind of cultural export that travels quietly through everyday life rather than headline entertainment moments, and so tends to go unnoticed, even as it spreads. The increasing presence of Indian wedding traditions and fashion sensibilities inside the wedding culture of countries with no significant South Asian population of their own. Anyone who has attended or even just scrolled past footage of a contemporary wedding almost anywhere in the world over the past decade has likely encountered some trace of this without necessarily recognizing where it came from. A Sangeet night, an evening dedicated entirely to music and choreographed dance performances by family members, held the evening before the main ceremony, has become an increasingly common feature of weddings well outside any Indian or South Asian cultural context, borrowed largely through visibility on social media and through the enormous, highly publicized celebrity weddings that have taken place within India in recent years, as a way of extending a wedding celebration into a multi-day event rather than a single afternoon ceremony. The visual language of Bollywood's own wedding sequences, vibrant, saturated color palettes, elaborate floral installations, coordinated group choreography, has in turn become a genuine reference point for wedding planners and couples internationally, adopted not as a form of costume, but as a legitimate aesthetic influence in its own right, the way earlier generations of Western wedding fashion borrowed from French couture or English garden traditions. This kind of quiet, everyday cultural transmission is worth noting, alongside the more headline-grabbing crossover moments we've spent time with tonight, because it points to something the box office numbers and subscriber counts don't fully capture on their own. Indian popular culture's influence has never really depended on any single viral moment or Oscar campaign to spread. It moves the way most durable cultural influence eventually does, through weddings attended, through a friend's recommendation of a show, through a song heard once at someone else's celebration and quietly searched for afterward, until, gradually, and mostly without anyone consciously tracking it, an entire aesthetic vocabulary migrates from one culture's private celebrations into another's, indistinguishable, eventually, from a habit the borrowing culture might swear it had always practiced on its own. Step back far enough from any single film, song, or creator we've discussed tonight, and a larger pattern comes into view, one that a handful of cultural critics and journalists have started describing in the past several years using some version of the phrase "new kings of the world," a pointed inversion of the old assumption that American entertainment sits, by default, at the center of global pop culture, with everything else treated as regional or niche by comparison. The observation, made by several writers independently around the same period, is that Bollywood, alongside Turkish television dramas and Korean pop music, has quietly become one of a small handful of genuinely global entertainment forces operating largely outside and increasingly on equal footing with the traditional American entertainment machine, reaching audiences across the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, and increasingly Europe and the Americas, without needing Hollywood's approval or distribution infrastructure to get there. This isn't a brand new phenomenon, even if the specific language describing it is fairly recent. Bollywood films have circulated widely across the Middle East, parts of Africa and Central Asia for decades, often finding audiences there long before any comparable American cultural export arrived, built on trade routes, diaspora communities, and cultural affinities that predate the internet entirely. What has changed, and changed quite recently, is the infrastructure connecting all of that pre-existing global appetite directly to the audiences who have it, without requiring a Western intermediary, a licensing deal with an American broadcaster, or a physical cassette or DVD smuggled across a border, the way earlier generations of Bollywood fans outside India often had to encounter the films they loved. Streaming platforms did that work almost by accident, building global infrastructure primarily to serve their existing American and European subscriber bases, and then discovering, as recommendation algorithms began surfacing genuinely popular non-Western content to audiences who had never specifically gone looking for it, that the appetite for this material had been sitting there, mostly invisible to industry executives, the entire time. The Indian diaspora plays a significant role in this story too, though it's worth being precise about exactly what role it plays, because it's easy to overstate. Communities of Indian origin, spread across the UK, the United States, Canada, the Gulf states, and elsewhere, numbering collectively in the tens of millions, have long provided a built-in, devoted audience for Bollywood cinema and Indian music outside India's own borders. The reason Shah Rukh Khan's films have reliably performed well in cinemas in London and Toronto for decades, long before any of tonight's other crossover moments occurred. But what's genuinely new about the last several years is the growing evidence that Indian entertainment is reaching well beyond that diaspora base, pulling in audiences with no personal or family connection to India at all. Diplo dancing at Coachella to a language he doesn't speak, Lady Gaga mouthing along to Natu Natu, teenagers in Ohio discovering a Tamil action film through a Netflix recommendation with no cultural context whatsoever guiding them there. That is a meaningfully different phenomenon than diaspora nostalgia, and it's the piece of the story that has genuinely surprised even people who study global media patterns closely for a living. None of this happened through any single coordinated strategy. It happened through the accumulation of hundreds of individual moments, a well-timed Oscar campaign, a single unforgettable festival set, a streaming platform's recommendation algorithm quietly noticing that a Tamil thriller was holding viewers' attention just as effectively as a Scandinavian crime drama, and deciding on purely commercial grounds to keep pushing it toward more people who might feel the same way. Which means, in its own quiet way, this entire story connects back to something we've touched on elsewhere on this channel: the strange, unplanned way algorithmic recommendation systems, built for entirely commercial reasons with no cultural mission behind them at all, keep accidentally becoming engines of genuine cross-cultural discovery, introducing audiences to entire worlds of music and storytelling that geography and language would, in an earlier era, have kept permanently out of reach. There's one more texture worth spending a little time with before we let this story rest tonight. Something harder to pin down in facts and figures than box office numbers or subscriber counts. But that runs through nearly everything we've discussed. A particular relationship with color, festivity, and sensory abundance that distinguishes so much of Indian popular culture from the more visually restrained aesthetic sensibilities that dominate a lot of contemporary Western film and television. Consider Holi, the spring festival of color, celebrated across India and increasingly in smaller diaspora versions in cities around the world, crowds filling streets and open spaces, throwing handfuls of brightly colored powder at friends and strangers alike, until entire neighborhoods are, for one day, awash in pink and yellow and green, a sanctioned, joyful abandonment of ordinary restraint that has made its way, in fragmented, commercialized form, into everything from international music festivals borrowing the aesthetic for their own color powder-throwing events to the visual language of Bollywood films themselves, which frequently stage major musical sequences explicitly built around Holi or Holi-adjacent imagery, precisely because the festival offers filmmakers a built-in, culturally resonant justification for exactly the kind of maximalist visual spectacle Indian cinema has always gravitated toward. That same sensibility shows up in Heeramandi's candlelit opulence, in the sheer scale of RR's action sequences, in the elaborate, festival-bright costuming of a major Bollywood wedding sequence, in the neon-lit stage design of a Diljit Dosanjh arena show. It is not, as it can sometimes be read by outside eyes unfamiliar with the underlying tradition, mere excess for its own sake. It reflects a different, equally coherent set of aesthetic values, one that treats visual and sensory abundance as a legitimate, even necessary vehicle for emotional and spiritual expression, rooted in centuries of Indian devotional art, temple architecture, and classical dance and music traditions that long predate cinema, television, or any other modern medium we've discussed tonight. Where a certain strand of contemporary Western storytelling has, in recent decades, increasingly prized restraint, muted color palettes, and understatement as markers of seriousness and prestige, Indian popular culture has largely continued operating from an entirely different premise, that grandeur, color, and unapologetic scale can themselves be a form of seriousness, a way of honoring the emotional weight of a story, rather than undercutting it. It's worth sitting with the fact that neither approach is more sophisticated or more valid than the other. They are simply different answers to the same underlying question every storyteller eventually has to face, about how much visual and emotional volume a story needs in order to be felt properly by its audience. And it may be part of why so much of what we've spent time with tonight, RR's earnest, maximalist spectacle, Heeramandi's candlelit richness, Diljit Dosanjh's exuberant, color-saturated stage presence, has traveled so effectively to audiences who arrived with zero cultural context, no prior familiarity with the specific traditions being drawn on, and still found themselves moved anyway. Sincerity and scale, delivered without irony, seem to translate across language and culture in a way that more knowing, more reserved storytelling sometimes struggles to. Taken together, everything we've walked through tonight, the Oscar stage, the tiger in the colonial garden, the candlelit courtesans, the broken village generator, the Coachella turban, the restaurant where a future YouTube star once sang for a few dollars a week, the 8-decade voice that a nation mourned as though it had lost a head of state, the god of cricket emptying entire city streets whenever he walked out to bat. None of it exists in isolation. It is all, in its own way, the same underlying machine, running on the same underlying fuel, an enormous, endlessly renewing appetite across more than 1 billion people for shared spectacle, for a voice or a face or a performance large enough to be felt collectively at the same moment by an audience that dwarfs the population of most entire countries. That machine has been running for well over a century now, largely out of view of the English-speaking world's usual cultural radar, occasionally throwing off a fragment bright enough to cross over, a song at the Oscars, a set at Coachella, a subscriber race against a Swedish gamer, before receding again into a scale of ongoing production and devotion that most outside observers never get close enough to properly register. What has changed, gradually and then quite suddenly over the last several years, is simply how many doors have opened between that machine and the rest of the world, and how easily, once opened, audiences with no prior context at all keep finding themselves pulled through them anyway. Let's begin winding down now, gently, the way we always do toward the end of these stories. What we've moved through tonight, from a stadium moment at the Oscars, through a tiger released into a colonial garden party, through candlelit courtesans and a broken village generator, through a Coachella stage and a deli restaurant where a future YouTube star once earned a few dollars a week singing for strangers, is only the smallest possible fraction of what exists inside India's popular culture, a fraction chosen more or less arbitrarily out of an ocean far too large for any single night or any single channel to properly hold. There are entire film industries we didn't touch tonight. Malayalam, Kannada cinema, each with their own decades of stars and traditions fully as rich as anything we did cover. There are musical traditions, regional television phenomena, entire generations of playback singers and classical performers whose names would mean nothing to most audiences outside India and everything to audiences within it. What we walked through tonight was never meant to be complete. It was meant to be a door left open, in case any small piece of it caught your attention enough to wander back through on your own. Sometime. If none of it caught your attention in that way tonight, that's all right too. You don't need to have followed a single name, retained a single fact, kept any of the details in order. Somewhere in the last stretch of this story, your attention may already have started to drift, softening at the edges the way it's supposed to by now. And that drifting is not a failure to keep up. It's simply what this kind of listening, at this hour, in this kind of quiet, is for. In a little while my voice will fade out completely, and what follows will just be steady, even white noise. Nothing left to listen for, nothing left to follow, just something soft and constant to rest inside as you finish drifting off. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight, and nothing left that needs your attention. Just let go, a little more with each breath, and let the rest of the night take care of itself. Sleep well.